morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to Grove Church of Christ, all those who are watching. I would like to welcome you. At any time you would like to come and visit us, we'd love to have you. Just have a few announcements. Got a pretty lengthy sick list that just got added too. Hibernia's home, is she doing better? Getting better? Oh, good news there. Gary is still at Mercy Health there in Paducah. Tia Lovett's at Lakeway. Vicky is sick today. Nell Langston is sick. Mark Butler is sick. Chris Coble, Gail English, and Joseph Henson are all home sick. Are there any others that anyone knows about? All right, Kathy Kretzinger is still sick. Jill is sick. I was joking earlier with Larry. I thought it might be easier to tell who all was here than who all is sick. But it's that time of year. Everybody wash your hands real well. So if there's no others sick, we'll start in our Bible class. Who's that? Okay. Margarine Pace is back at Calvert. So
good morning. It's good to see everyone here this morning. I guess we're among the blessed ones to be here, sounds like. Jill, if you're watching, drink plenty of fluids, get some rest. No. That was Mark. We're in the Epistle of James, as all of you know, who've been here on a regular basis recently, and we'll begin a study of chapter 5. James is a letter that, as we work our way through each chapter, and now in the last chapter, we could ask with every study, what is a Christian to do? That's been our subtitle throughout our study, and it certainly is a letter that answers that question every step of the way. And that will be, of course, true as we work our way through the 5th chapter as well. We will see James giving us instruction and teaching and encouragement and warnings as we live the Christian life. So we turn our attention to the first part of chapter 5. We can see the development of the teaching along these lines. First, we have in first part of this chapter a condemnation of the rich, and that is followed by an exhortation to be patient. And so we will appreciate once again several things about James' style or his approach to encouraging us and teaching us and trying to draw us in to think about Christian things and spiritual things. He'll use everyday illustrations. And that's been something throughout. It'd be a very interesting personal read to go back and start in chapter 1 and with a notebook and just make a note of all the illustrations he uses from everyday life. He does so also by appealing to Old Testament examples. And he will make reference to the prophets and Elijah here in chapter 5. By way of everyday illustrations, he'll appeal to farmers to say, here's something that the farmer does that's kind of like being a Christian. You just have to wait and learn to trust in the Lord. So we'll see this motif continue, and we'll appreciate it as we have throughout our study of the letter of James. Let's turn our attention to this first several verses, verses 1 through 6, of what we can fittingly describe as James' condemnation of the rich. Now, you'll see on the chart that in the previous one and this one, I have put the rich in quotes because we really have to define that, right? Who are the rich in this section of verses? As we read it, we see that James is very sharp in his condemnation of the rich. And it calls upon us to think about exactly who he's talking about. Let's just read these 6 verses and then think about trying to understand who he's talking to, or we might say who he's talking about as he writes these matters. James 5, verse 1, and then through verse 6 says, "Come now, ye rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and your silver are rusted, and their rust shall be a testimony against you, and shall eat your flesh as fire. You've laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the hire of the laborers who mowed your fields, which is of you kept back by fraud, cries out. And the cries of them that reaped have entered into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived delicately on the earth, or luxuriously, and have taken your pleasures. You have nourished your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned, you have killed the righteous. He does not resist you." Now, let's make a distinction between these two things. Who is James writing to, and then who is James talking about? Because those are different questions. He's writing to Christians, obviously, but who's he talking about? He's talking about, quote, the rich. And let's think about this in a couple of ways. First of all, it appears that as James talks about, quote, the rich, come on now, you rich folks, he does not seem to be addressing faithful Christian people. He is talking to Christians about, I would say, people in the world. And the way he describes them is in a very worldly and wicked way. And he indicates that judgment is coming for you. So he is talking about people who seem to be in the world and oppressing Christian people. So he's writing to Christians, but he's talking about people in the world. All right, yeah, they're described in a very wicked way. Now, we do have to remember the fact that he has acknowledged in the first chapter that Christians can be found across the economic spectrum. And he said back in chapter 1, verses 9 and 10, that brothers, he addressed them, so we know he's talking to Christians. Poor brethren, you need to think about your high position. Rich brethren, you need to keep that in perspective and that you are brought low. I mean, your riches get you nowhere with God spiritually. You have to be humble. So he talked to rich and poor Christian people and encouraged them both in their unique circumstances to use spiritual values and have this balance and understanding of their circumstances. He doesn't seem to be addressing rich or wealthy Christians here. I believe he's addressing, by his description, worldly or wicked people who have been in a position to take advantage of others, and Christian people, if they're faithful to the Lord, wouldn't do that. So if that is the case, he's addressing non-Christians. The question would be, well, they don't care what James has to say. And again, well, he's not writing to them. He's writing to Christian people. But he is writing about them. And why would that be? Well, when you think about the developing teaching here, he is doing two things. Number one, he is reminding Christian people, don't envy these folks in the world because of what they have or who they are, because misery is coming to them. And that's one of the things he projects. You have to think about the end. So don't envy them. Furthermore, he encourages them to be faithful no matter what, and to be patient. That then is the developing emphasis. You wait on the Lord, you be patient, because your vindication is coming. The tables are going to be turned, you might say, when the Lord comes. So it is a valuable perspective for Christian people to think about. They will be vindicated, and those individuals in the world who may oppress them or ridicule them will themselves be judged. But let's look a little bit more at this question about who James is talking about. And Mark touched on this just a minute ago. What is it that finds them displeasing to God? It is not merely that they have wealth, right? He is not just simply talking about a class of people, the wealthy, and saying all people who have means are wicked people because they have wealth. That's not what he's saying, is it? What he describes here is the misuse of wealth. Rich oppressors. Right. What did we see described here but certain kinds of behaviors? So we make these distinctions. We have people described in the Bible who are wealthy people and at the same time faithful people. Whether you think about in the Old Testament, people like Abraham, or you think about the early church, someone like Barnabas. We don't have a clear picture of his financial status, but he did have a piece of property that he could liquidate and then gave the proceeds to help the church. You have Paul encouraging Christian people who are people of wealth to think about that and use it properly. He didn't condemn them just because they had these resources. You can see this in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 17 through 19, where Paul says to Timothy, charge those who are rich according to this world not to be high-minded, to think about what they have in a proper way. And here's even what Paul says, things that were given to them to enjoy. Sometimes Christian people get the mistaken idea that if you enjoy what you have or enjoy this life, well, that's not right. Well, that's not helpful either. But to have a proper perspective is. Think about this text from Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 through 10. You remember this? Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not upon your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your paths. Now, isn't that what a Christian should do? Trust in the Lord. And then the passage goes on to say, honor the Lord with your substance. And he begins to talk about blessings and resources. And in this particular ancient way, that your vats may be overflowing with new wine. What does that mean? That you might have an abundant harvest. And so we make this observation that the Bible is not saying money is evil. Having any kind of wealth or resources is necessarily evil. James is not just putting everybody in some class because they have resources, but his description is of the misuse of wealth. And in this case, he is, while talking to Christian people, making this condemnation so clear. Christian people should never envy, never get into that trap of this worldly way of thinking about material things. Well, let's unpack this a little bit and see how what we read a minute ago unfolds. Look at the different ways he addresses this matter. Those who are described as the worldly rich are, first of all, pronounced, or we might say, categorized as those who have misery on the way. Verse 1, this condemnation or this rebuke unfolds. And he describes in the verses we read things like hoarding wealth. And he describes defrauding workers, living indulgently. And that is, to the exclusion of any kind of concern for opportunities maybe to help other people. And then this theme continues when he talks about using their position to really hurt other people, or they have advanced themselves by stepping on other people, the oppression of the righteous. Just for the sake of being thorough, let's look at these different expressions and make sure we can appreciate the way in which James casts this rebuke. Verse 1 says, "Come now, ye rich." You might see this familiar address if you look back to verse 13. Come now. And that's just saying, hey, wait a minute. Or, look at this. So it's grabbing our attention. Look at this, rich folks. Here comes the warning. Weep and howl. Now the word howl is interesting. You'll find it as the English choice of translation in the King James, New King James, ASV, ESV, and yet I don't know if it's a word you use on a regular basis or not. I think of the word howl like a kid, playing a joke or something. But why is this such a regular choice among various versions? And it is because the translators are trying to communicate the fact that the word James uses means, as some other renditions are, wailing out loud. Out loud is the point. So you can cry without making a noise. But James calls on them, this is interesting, he calls on them, in essence, to burst out in wailing, to cry out loud. And this then is the scene. Why is that? If you only knew the miseries that were coming, you would just be crying at the top of your lungs. The miseries that are coming. He's talking in a judgment way. Not just the mere reversal of fortune, so to speak, but in a spiritual sense. There are miseries coming that are hard to understand, hard to get your mind around in terms of how bad it will be. So your riches are not going to isolate you from the reality of judgment. So he begins to talk about this misuse of wealth under the theme, you might say, in verses 2 and 3 of hoarding. That is being just completely self-centered. When you have the ability to help other people who may be in great need. He says, your riches are corrupted. Your garments are moth-eaten. And as this similar imagery unfolds with different, illustrations, your riches, a general word, your riches are spoiling, your garments are moth-eaten, your gold and silver are rusted, and then here comes the punchline. All of this is a demonstration, right? You've just been accumulating and hoarding and not using it for any kind of positive end. And it's just sitting over there and wasting away. But you would rather, he says to these folks, you would rather it just waste away than to give up one measly dime to help somebody else. That's the picture he paints. And this is not hypothetical. There are people who are that selfish. And they don't have any compassion to think about other people. Right? It's theirs. They work for it. And that's that. Someone might say, as some have, well, this shows how the Bible is full of mistakes, and this is just an old book. We shouldn't really take it seriously. It has all kinds of errors in it, and here's one of the thousands of errors or contradictions you're going to find. Gold and silver don't rust. And so you folks, bless your hearts, you take the Bible seriously, but it's just an old book full of legends and mistakes and errors. And James wasn't inspired of God. If he was inspired of God, he wouldn't make a mistake like that. And when people start making comments like that and charges like that, as someone might say, they're getting a little over their skis. What does that figure of speech mean? They're getting ahead of themselves. And the word rust, in terms of the ancient word James uses, is not necessarily the same absolute idea of oxidation that we think of when it comes to certain metals rusting in that context. So it could just simply mean degrade or become inferior in some kind of way. And so things that are handled, like precious metals, can degrade. And that's why when folks sell precious metals or precious coins, they are evaluated, they are appraised, and people keep these things in little cases so they're not touched and they don't degrade. They are assessed in terms of a certain value based upon its quality. So these precious metals can in some way corrode or be degraded based upon their care. So we're not going to get distracted by the word rust, as some would like us to do, but you might be interested to know that's kind of a charge made here with this verse. But James' point is, if you kind of take his picture and envision walking down an old, creaky staircase into a basement, and opening up a door, it creaks, and a little light is pulled, and there are cobwebs everywhere. There's a pile of fine clothing that's all moth-eaten, and there's all of this treasure that's just corroded. There they have it. Every once in a while they walk down there, turn the little light on, get a look of it. And they close the door and go back upstairs. All the while, their neighbor has a child with a brain tumor, and they are just poor, poor people. Nobody's there to lift a helping hand. To close one's heart up to compassion is a selfish and wicked thing. And so James paints that picture, the misuse of one's resources. Whoops, sorry about that. And so he further describes this as in an ancient setting. He describes this as something we should give thought to. Look at verse 4 again. Behold, the hire of the laborers. You might have a little bit different version. The wages, right? That's what we're talking about. The wages of the laborers who mowed your field, which you kept back. You owed it to them, but you kept it back. The wages cry out. Do you remember when in Genesis chapter 4, God confronts Cain? And there in that setting, God used a similar expression. He said something was crying out. What was that? Abel's blood crying out from the ground. And here James says it's like these wages. Like, here's the money. Like, here's an envelope in this, we could say Scrooge, I guess. That would be a fitting word. Here is this person who's hired someone to mow their field, and there's the cash, an envelope in the old desk drawer. And at the end of the day, he says, well, you come back tomorrow, and, I need to look over your work, or whatever. Did they show up? Did they do what they were supposed to do? And then you hear from that desk drawer the wages crying out. We shouldn't be here. We shouldn't be held back. So the wages are personified as speaking out and saying, this is wrong. Now, why do I say we think about this in terms of an ancient context? You think about Jesus' story of the laborers who went out at different times of day. You remember that? And at the end of the day, they were paid. And that depicts a certain setting in first century Palestine that was very common. That people were day laborers. They were paid at the end of the day. Now, what kind of financial condition is someone in if their situation is that they go out and they find work for the day and need to be paid at the end of the day. They need that shilling, or they need that denarius. They need that 17 cents so that they can buy food for that day. It's no wonder that Jesus, in speaking to people of his day, said, pray like this: Father, give us this day our daily bread. So you talk about living to paycheck, and that's paycheck is at the end of every day. And that's why the scene here is so despicable. That someone who has this basement full of treasure and these lands is so greedy, he won't even pay them their 17 cents at the end of the day for the job that they agreed to do that he wanted them to do. So you see this mindset of selfishness described here that is just beyond comprehension. He says, so that's what's going on. And then in the latter part of verse 4, he's telling Christian people to think about this. They may be in this situation of being defrauded of their wages. And he says, the cries of those that reaped have entered the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. Now that's not Sabbath. It looks real close to the word Sabbath, but that's not the word Sabbath or week, W-E-E-K. It is the word meaning armies. Sometimes you'll see it rendered Lord Almighty or Lord of Hosts. Lord of Hosts is really familiar to Old Testament readers, right? Who is the Lord of Hosts? The Lord of heaven's armies. So James, in using a particular name for God, that we might even say would resonate especially with Jews who were Christians in those early days, says, your cries are coming before the Lord of heaven's armies. And so he rounds out the discussion by saying, at the same time that these folks defraud people of what is to them very, very little. They're living it up, living luxuriously, taking your pleasure. And the last part of verse 5 says, you're nourishing your hearts in a day of slaughter. Like cattle or hogs or sheep or whatever that's being fed out, fattened up, for what? For slaughter. He says, you're just preparing yourself in this way for a rude awakening. So in verse 6, he says, you've taken advantage of other people. You've killed righteous folks, and they're not even putting up a fight. This is a picture of worldliness at its worst, misusing all of God's blessing and taking advantage of those who are poor. Now, in the next section, James gives this now exhortation or makes this appeal for Christians to be patient. That's clearly not always easy to do. To wait on the Lord. We begin to think about being treated unfairly, or maybe lashing out, or maybe even becoming so irritable we start fighting amongst ourselves. We can become so stressed and anxious and concerned and strapped financially and dealing with all kinds of issues that we might find it difficult to continue to trust the Lord in this environment. We might have faith issues, doubting about God, wondering why He doesn't bless us, why do wicked people prosper so well. All of these things talked about in Psalm 73, James here encourages Christian people to be patient. Let's think about this, and likely we'll return to this section of verses next week and think about these beautiful examples that James gives us, as well as the illustration. As you reflect upon this section of verses, you're going to see over and over the word patience and endure. So as we read these verses, just let those words ring out. Think about how many times in this small section of verses he uses the word patient or endure or steadfast or some variant like that. James 5, verses 7 through 11. Be patient, therefore, brethren. Right? This is carrying over from the previous discussion. They are folks who are on the other end of this situation previously described. They are the oppressed, or they are the ones defrauded of their wages. Be patient, therefore, brethren. Now, he's talking to them directly. Be patient, therefore, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. Behold, the husbandman, or the farmer, waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being what? Patient over it, until it receives the early and latter rain. Be ye also patient, established or strengthened in your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Murmur not, don't grumble, brethren, one against another, that ye be not judged. Behold, the judge stands at the doors. Take, brethren, for an example of suffering and of patience, the prophets who spake in the name of the Lord. Behold, we call them blessed that endured. You've heard of the patience of Job and have seen the end of the Lord, and how that the Lord is full of compassion and merciful. So you can see how many times he's talking about you. We know what he's talking about here, and what he's emphasizing is valuable for Christian people to think about. Let's talk about these words, patience and endurance, or be patient and endure. There are two different words here used by James, words that are commonly found throughout the New Testament to describe this idea. They have a little bit different meaning, and so it gives us kind of an appreciation of the full color spectrum here about what's involved in this matter of relying and trusting and being patient, waiting on the Lord. In the first several verses here, the word patient comes from the word makrothumeo, and later in the text, you've heard of the patience of Job. That's actually a different word. That's the word hupomeno, or the noun form is hupomone. Why does that matter? What's the difference? Well, there seems to be some overlap as they're used together here, but there are some interesting differences, I think, that will help us as Christians think about circumstances and situations where we really have to grit our teeth and just hang on to what the Lord has promised. The term makrothumeo, or the noun makrothumia, has to do with how we respond to provocation. Or it can refer to the state of just remaining tranquil while we wait for a better outcome. Now, this is very interesting. This word is used of God, but the other word, hupomone, is never used of God. Now let's talk about why. This kind of gives us an idea of the shades of meaning involved here. God is said to be patient or long-suffering with us, because this word often involves the idea of being patient under provocation. That is, the very idea embedded within this concept and that is communicated by this word is there is a need to be patient with other people. Provocation means somebody is needling you or somebody is mistreating you, and you're having to be patient, turn it over to the Lord, recognize that all accounts are not going to be settled in this life. Wait on the Lord, all of that. Not retaliate, not take vengeance upon yourself. To maintain your spiritual integrity in spite of the provocation. Now, God is said to be patient because we provoke Him. He may be long-suffering. He may give us time. He may give us opportunity. He may give us instruction. He may work with us providentially. But people, by their lives, by their decisions, can provoke Him. Are we not thankful that the Lord is patient and long-suffering? But the other word has a little bit different shade of meaning that is never applied to God. You've heard of the patience of Job. This word for patience has to do not with dealing with people, but dealing with circumstances. And the idea is to, like under a load, just resist, to resist with force against these circumstances, to endure. God never finds him in a situation where he says, I just got to power through this. I just got to deal with it. He doesn't do that. Now, he's patient with people. But he never has challenging circumstances. We do. Job found himself in some very challenging circumstances with all of the things that he endured. So both of these matters are here encouraged and kind of blended together in this text. We may find ourselves tested by people that are making our lives more difficult. We may find ourselves in circumstances to no fault of our own that also are trying and difficult. What's the message? Be patient. Be steadfast. Like the farmer. Like the prophets. Like Job. All right, we'll revisit this and walk through these verses and hear what James has to say to encourage us to rely upon the Lord no matter what we're going through in this life. Thank you for being in our class today.